When region-wide data center travel was added back in the first half of 2022, it's safe to say that many of us assumed that this meant it was only a matter of time before worldwide data center travel would be coming. In fact, according to an interview from back in 2023, the technical aspects are already built, whatever that means exactly, so it must mean something else is stalling or entirely halting the process. A particular point raised by Yoshi P himself was the differences in culture between regions. But is that it? Is that the only thing? Let's talk about a few of the differences between regions and how worldwide data center travel might impact this negatively. So let's start with the cultural differences thing, because often when I discuss this aspect, I hear a lot of voices responding with, "But we're not that different." To demonstrate how different even the Western regions are, let's take a quick look at an aspect of party finder groups. I've never been on the NA data centers, however, to my understanding, based on accounts from many players from NA, the gold standard for agreeing on strats in Party Finder, for example, is what I have previously referred to as the marker dance. I am reasonably confident that what that means is that you put down markers to indicate where people need to stand for a mechanic, or to indicate groups, and people take their position so everyone knows where they need to stand. Now, you might be realizing that I have never seen this in EU personally, given that I'm assuming what it looks like. In the EU data centers, the gold standard is a macro that just details everyone's positions, and then each player just calls which spot they want, and then that applies for all the mechanics listed in the macro. Obviously, there will still be markers down on the field, but those are specifically used to indicate what is said on one or multiple parts of the macro. I've been told this is also the way the JP data centers do things. That is to say, even the Western regions can't agree on something like this. Another example of how different regions can differ in their culture and approach to the game is in how a small data center survives, or functions. Dynamis, the newest data center in NA, is sort of notoriously known to be a dead data center, because you just visit any of the other data centers in the region if you have to queue for something. This mutual understanding that the data center is quote-unquote dead means that this is a negative feedback loop. There are no people queuing on Dynamis because everyone goes elsewhere, which then means no one is queuing on Dynamis. We will get back to this kind of problem later in this video. Now, compare this to the Materia data center, the only OCE data center. There, I have been told the approach to queuing for things that are not on the quote-unquote main path is done by making party finder groups and people help each other. You can probably already tell that if we had worldwide data center travel, there's a much greater chance that the Materia data center would have used a similar approach to the Dynamis data center. However, there's one core reason why that might not be a good solution. I will get back to this. Let's continue with another difference. A commonly known aspect of queuing being available for extreme content is that apparently in the JP data centers it is totally normal to straight up queue for extremes and simply doing it. This has become somewhat commonly known because it is usually the best argument against removing the ability to queue for extremes, and also removing extremes from things like Mentor Roulette. Because at least one region is using the tool, it can't just be removed like that, is the logic, right? Another more social aspect of cultural differences is that in the JP region, cities are more quiet, or so I have been told. JP players more commonly communicate in more private chat channels like Tells or Party Chat or even FC chats, making the say, yell and shout chats a lot more empty in cities. Compare this to EU or NA, where standing around in Limsa Lomensa will easily and very quickly, might I add, fill your chat log with conversations of varying sorts. There is, of course, also the key difference that in NA, EU and OCE, the expected default language for most players is English. In JP, the expected default language is Japanese, with the exception that certain servers have a large enough population of English-speaking players that it isn't unexpected if some players default to English there. A very good argument for why this part won't be a problem with worldwide data center travel is that naturally the English speakers will simply go home after visiting a JP data center, given that they have very little or nothing to do there anyway if they can't communicate. However, an example of how this could pose a problem is that sometimes social aspects in an MMO like Final Fantasy XIV functions by mutual respect. The reason why it is more common to simply queue for an extreme in JP data centers is because the culture there is that you don't want to stand out and be a problem for the group. So, of course, you show up prepared. At least in EU, I can say for certain that it is not everyone who queues up for an extreme that has read or watched a guide on the fight they're going into. So this kind of mutual respect of being prepared might fall apart if, hypothetically, Western players realize that we could just go to JP and queue there. Of course, there are also many other social and cultural differences between regions, and I just wanted to highlight a few to clarify how different we can be on some specific issues. Now, with those softer social and cultural aspects out of the way, there are two other things I think are crucially important to consider in regards to worldwide data center travel. The first one might eventually be resolved, as this is about latency. While with worldwide data center travel I could visit friends on NA, I would have terrible latency compared to in EU. And that is just how things are. Which means that while I could play with my friends in NA, it would probably always be an inferior experience for me. The somewhat recent cloud data center test suggested that this would alleviate a lot of the latency issues if this eventually became commonplace. So that might be an issue that can be resolved eventually. Then again, I imagine some of you might say, well, I just want to visit my friends and see them in-game. We don't have to play actual content together. Which, fair, however, there's another crucial reason why this kind of latency issue has to be resolved before a worldwide data center travel system is implemented. In NA, Ether is the place you go to when you want to raid. Because of people realizing there are more party finder groups on the Ether data center, people go there, which then leads to even less party finder groups in the other data centers, which then makes even more people go to Ether instead as a perpetual loop. In EU, Light is the place you go to when you want to raid, for the exact same reason. In JP, you go to Mana. To give a bit of perspective to this, we had a similar issue, albeit not the same one, in PvP years ago. There was a time when frontline groups were determined by which grand company you were part of. If you were Maelstrom, you always represented Maelstrom in frontline. This led to a winner team joiner effect where people actually interested in PvP and winning would switch their grand company to whichever one wins more, which leads to there being more good players on that team, leading to the other teams losing more. And as time passes, more and more people will simply join the winners. Eventually, this causes a problem where the winner team basically never has queues pop because there's only a fraction of the players on the other teams. On the other hand, the other teams might have much faster queues, but they're queuing into their own slaughter. They're not going to win. This was fixed by removing this barrier and making it so that you get matched randomly. The Party Finder equivalent of this would be if Party Finder was region-wide. Then all of the NA data centers would be on an equal playing field in this regard. On EU, Chaos and Light would be on an even playing field as well, and the same also applies for JP. There is a possibility that there are some kind of hardware technical reasons why this isn't possible at the moment, but I can't possibly know whether that is actually the case. After all, I am just some smart guy with a microphone and an idea. You might be wondering why this is relevant to worldwide data center travel. Essentially, what we have right now is a king data center in each region, where everyone meets to make their groups. If worldwide data center travel became a thing, then, at the very least, NA, EU, and OCE would have reason to simply flock to one data center to make their party finder groups. In general, I could imagine it would be Ether. Why would that be a problem? I don't know, I would like to play Final Fantasy XIV on a decent latency. Given they have EU servers, that should not be too much to ask, should it? But if we have to meet on an NA data center to find players, it can be difficult to actually find a group of EU players to then meet up with back over on Chaos or Light. This part of the problem could of course solve itself if the cloud server solution fixes most if not all of the latency issues that might crop up. But that wouldn't change the simple fact that Ether itself wouldn't be able to handle that many players coming to it specifically. If it could, then there would be no reason to have 4 NA data centers in the first place. In other words, to combat such a problem, worldwide data center travel might require worldwide party finder, at least as a toggle or something, so that you don't have to come to Ether or any other quote-unquote hub data center to find your groups. So in summary, while there are some cultural concerns preventing the implementation of worldwide data center travel, that doesn't change the fact that there clearly are also some technical concerns that might need to be dealt with first. And that is of course assuming we will ever get worldwide data center travel. Who knows, maybe the cultural concerns are too big to ever allow it. But what do you think? Do you think we're ready for worldwide data center travel? Do you think the cultural differences thing is silly and we should just get over it? Whatever it is, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, World of Warcraft has had a similar problem with the hardcore raiders congregating on a specific faction. This was finally somewhat resolved by allowing players from both factions to group up for raiding if they so choose. This is essentially the closest we get to the equivalent of region-wide party finder.